As is well known, Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, begins with an account of the creation of the world. First comes the account given by P, and then comes the account given by J. It's said that God existed before there was anything, and He created everything step by step. In the beginning, there was, quote, a formless void. And God then performs the act of creation by distinguishing different things within it, thus giving the world distinguishable elements, so to speak. The first thing that God does is to distinguish light from darkness, that is, day from night. Then He distinguishes the sky from the waters, then the waters from dry land, and so forth. The culmination of the act of creation is life. God creates animals and human beings. In this creation, humans are conceived as something special, made in God's image. God gives humans dominion over the animal world. This account provides valuable insight into the ancient Hebrews' conception of their deity. When we compare this God with the gods of the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Homeric poems, we notice some important differences. It's not just that the Jews are monotheists and the Greeks and Near Eastern peoples are polytheists. Rather, there's something fundamentally different about the Hebrews' conception. We saw in Gilgamesh how the gods represented natural forces. There was the sun god Shamash, the moon god Sin, the storm god Adad, and so forth. Each of these gods was powerful in his or her own sphere, but none of them was all-powerful. None of these gods created the universe. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, things began with two gods, Apsu, or Abzu, who represents fresh waters, and Tiamat, who represents salt waters. Both of these, although older than the other gods, are still natural forces. By contrast, the God of the Hebrews is not a natural force. He's outside of nature. He existed before the creation, that is, before nature. Indeed, He created all of nature. Or put differently, the pagan gods all exist in the immanent sphere of nature, whereas Yahweh is transcendent, above nature. Thus, instead of being limited to a specific natural force like the gods of Gilgamesh or the Greeks, Yahweh, or Jehovah, is infinitely more powerful. He creates and is responsible not just for individual things or specific spheres, but everything in the universe. The distinction between these two conceptions of the divine can be illustrated with a brief glance at how the gods relate to nature. We saw in Gilgamesh the importance of the sun god Shamash. This is similar to the Greek god Helios or the Egyptian god Ra. In the ancient Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, they worship light and fire, which is conceived as the deity Ahura Mazda. All of these deities reflect an appreciation of the great importance of the sun that gives light, warmth, and life to the world. The God of the Hebrews is not like this. Instead, He commands the light to appear. Quote, "Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." This God is so much more powerful than the forces of nature that He can command them at will. He doesn't have to do anything. He simply says something and it's done. His creation is completely effortless. Compare this with Hephaestus, the Greek god of fire and metalworking, who physically has to make weapons of the god in a blacksmith shop. It's often been noted that Judaism differed from the other religions as the first monotheistic religion. Given the difference between the God of the Hebrews and those of the pagan religions, it's understandable that scholars sometimes talk about the monotheistic revolution in religion. But this is not so straightforward, especially in the early part of the Old Testament. In the ancient Middle East, there was a male pagan god named El, whom scholars argue was the origin of the conception of Yahweh. He was the supreme god of the Canaanites and the early Mesopotamian Semites. El was not associated with any of the natural forces. He was more powerful than the other gods, and it was thought that the ancient Jews adopted him, and in time, given his superiority, the other gods dropped out. Vestiges of this pagan heritage can be found in the text of Genesis. Yahweh seems to be speaking to other gods since He makes use not of the first person singular, but rather the first person plural. For example, in connection with the creation of human beings, He says, quote, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." Similarly, after the fall, God says, quote, "See, the man has become like one of us." These passages clearly show God talking to some other unnamed deities. More obviously, the patriarch Abraham is said to accept the blessing of El in Genesis 14, verse 18 to 20. In the book of Job, God mentions the existence of other gods explicitly. Moreover, Yahweh refers to himself as a jealous God, and one thing that constantly ignites his anger is when the Jews lapse and start to worship nature deities such as Baal or the golden calf. One of God's commandments is that the Jews should worship no other deities. Wellhausen claimed that the earliest biblical writers, the Elohist and the Yahwehist, represent what was in effect a polytheistic religion in contrast to the later writers. So the idea of monotheism developing from a polytheism is not as strange as it might at first seem. Indeed, it's historically documentable. The Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who reigned from 1353 to 1336 BC, or with an alternative dating 1351 to 1334, and was later known as Akhenaten, tried to eliminate the worship of many traditional Egyptian gods and introduce a monotheistic religion dedicated to the god Aten. Previously, Aten had been a sun god, but then in the new religion was promoted to the sole deity. Although this religion did not last long in Egypt, it has been argued that this was the beginning of the Jewish monotheism. The German poet and scholar Schiller argued that Moses, who was raised in Egypt, took these ideas and taught them to his people. Sigmund Freud gives a similar analysis in his book, Moses and Monotheism. In any case, the monotheistic revolution did not happen in a single step. It took time for the ancient Hebrews to think through the idea of a single God and all of its implications. This can also be seen in the anthropomorphisms, which seem to be more present in the early books. It's said that, quote, God planted a garden, and that Adam and Eve, quote, heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden. So God is very present in the early books and often reveals himself to the people. But as the text goes on, he makes fewer and fewer direct appearances. In short, he becomes more and more distant and transcendent.